Something extraordinary is happening inside your skull, something that no scientist on Earth fully understands, something that no supercomputer has ever been able to replicate, something so strange, so deeply mysterious that the world's most brilliant physicists, neuroscientists, and philosophers have argued about it for over a century, and they still cannot agree on even the basics. Right now, as you watch these words form in front of you, as you hear my voice settle into your ears, as you feel the weight of your body pressing into wherever you're sitting, something is experiencing all of that. Something is you. That word, experience, is the most dangerous word in all of science. Not dangerous because it's violent, not dangerous because it's forbidden, dangerous because it points at something that science, for all its breathtaking power, has never been able to explain. Dangerous because the moment you look at it directly, everything you thought you knew about reality starts to come apart at the seams. We have mapped the human genome. We have photographed black holes. We have sent machines beyond the edge of our solar system and watched them drift into the cold dark between the stars. We have split the atom, decoded ancient viruses, and built thinking machines that can write poetry and paint pictures and beat grandmasters at chess. But we cannot explain this. We cannot explain why the lights are on inside your head. This is your brain. 1.4 kilograms of electrochemical tissue, roughly the consistency of soft butter, powered by roughly 20 watts of energy, less than the bulb in a refrigerator. And yet, somehow, inside this modest machine, there is a universe. There is the color blue, the taste of cold water on a hot day, the feeling of grief at 3 in the morning, the sudden flash of understanding when a joke lands, the particular sensation of missing someone you love, the quiet terror of wondering whether any of this means anything at all. How does that happen? How does a collection of atoms, carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, arranged in specific patterns, feel? This is called the hard problem of consciousness. It was named by philosopher David Chalmers in 1995, though thinkers have circled it for thousands of years. And it is called hard, not because it requires complicated mathematics, but because it is hard in the deepest possible sense. It resists every tool we have. Every framework collapses in front of it. Every explanation, when examined closely enough, turns out to be explaining something else entirely. And for most of the 20th century, mainstream science did the only rational thing it could do with a problem it could not solve. It looked away. Consciousness was declared a problem for philosophers, not physicists. The brain was described as a biological computer. Inputs come in, outputs go out, and whatever happens in between is just information processing. We don't need to ask why it feels like anything. Feelings, in this view, are either an illusion or a story we tell ourselves after the fact, or simply not the kind of thing that physics is supposed to explain. This view is called physicalism. It is dominant. It is respectable. It is held by many of the smartest people alive. And it might be completely wrong, because in the last 30 years, a small but growing group of scientists has made a discovery so radical, so unsettling, so fundamentally threatening to the comfortable story we tell about reality, that many of their colleagues refuse to believe it. They discovered that the universe at its deepest level does not behave the way we thought it did. And they started to wonder whether consciousness might not be a product of the universe at all. They started to wonder whether consciousness might be built into it. To understand what these scientists found, we need to go back. Back further than neuroscience. Back further than biology. Back to the strangest set of experiments in the history of human knowledge. Back to the quantum world. In the early 20th century, physicists attempting to understand the behavior of very small things, electrons, photons, atoms, stumbled into something that has never stopped being terrifying. They found that the rules were different down there. Not just slightly different, totally different. As if the universe at its smallest scale runs on a completely different operating system than the one we experience in daily life. Consider the double-slit experiment. It is one of the most replicated, most confirmed, most extraordinary experiments in all of physics, and its result still makes no sense. Here is what happens. You take a beam of electrons, tiny particles, each one a real physical thing, and you fire them one at a time at a barrier with two narrow slits cut into it. Behind the barrier is a screen that records where each electron lands. Now, if electrons behaved like tiny cannonballs, you would expect to see two stripes on the screen, one behind each slit. The electron goes through slit 1 or slit 2, and it hits the screen in a place that reflects which slit it took. That is not what happens. What happens instead is that the electrons form an interference pattern, a series of alternating bright and dark stripes spread across the screen like the ripples you get when two waves overlap in water. This is the kind of pattern you only get when a wave passes through both slits simultaneously, interferes with itself, and lands on the screen. But each electron is a single particle. A single electron should go through one slit or the other. It should not go through both at once. And yet it does. It exists in some sense that defies ordinary language, in a state of being in two places at once. Physicists call this a superposition. The electron is not in slit 1 and not in slit 2 and not secretly in one of them, but we just don't know which. It is genuinely, provably, experimentally confirmed to be in both, until we look. Until we look. That is the truly terrifying part. When you set up a detector to find out which slit the electron goes through, when you observe it, the interference pattern disappears. The electron suddenly behaves like a particle. It picks one slit, goes through it, and makes a single stripe on the screen. It stops being a wave and becomes a particle the moment you look at it. This is called the collapse of the wave function. And no one, not in 100 years of trying, has been able to fully explain what causes it. The act of measurement, the act of observation. Something about the presence of a conscious observer seems to change the physical world. Not slightly, not at the margins, completely, fundamentally. The very nature of physical reality appears to depend on whether or not it's being looked at. This is not a philosophical position. It is an experimentally verified empirical fact, confirmed in hundreds of independent laboratories across the world, tested to extraordinary precision, and it remains, to this day, one of the most disturbing discoveries in the history of human knowledge. Niels Bohr, one of the founding fathers of quantum mechanics, said that it is meaningless to speak of the properties of a particle before you observe it. Before observation, the particle has no definite position, no definite momentum. It exists only as a cloud of probabilities, a smear of possibility, a ghost of what it might become. Albert Einstein hated this. He spent the last decades of his life trying to prove that quantum mechanics was incomplete, that there must be hidden variables, hidden information, that the electron really does have a definite position, we just don't know it. He wrote letters, he ran thought experiments, he argued with Bohr at conferences, he lost. In the 1960s and 70s, physicist John Bell devised a test that could, in principle, determine whether Einstein's hidden variables existed. A series of experiments carried out over the following decades by physicist Alain Aspect and others confirmed, beyond any reasonable doubt, that Einstein was wrong. There are no hidden variables. The universe really is, at its core, irreducibly probabilistic. Reality does not become real until it is observed. This is the point where most textbooks change the subject. They say quantum mechanics works at tiny scales, but the quantum weirdness disappears when you get to large objects like people or brains or cats or planets. The classical world and the quantum world are separate. The border between them is somewhere around the scale of molecules. Above that border, physics is Newtonian. Below it, physics is quantum. Stay on your own side of the line and everything makes sense. This is called decoherence. The idea is that quantum superpositions are incredibly fragile. Warm, wet, complex environments, like the inside of a cell or a brain, are so full of thermal noise and molecular vibration that quantum states collapse almost instantly, before they can do anything interesting, before they can travel across a synapse or influence a neural signal. The brain, in this view, is simply too warm, too wet, too messy for quantum mechanics to matter. For most of the 20th century, that argument kept the door to quantum consciousness firmly closed. And then, in 1989, a mathematical physicist at Oxford University opened it back up. His name was Roger Penrose, and he was about to change everything. Roger Penrose is not an ordinary scientist. He shared the 2020 Nobel Prize in Physics for his work on black holes. He has made fundamental contributions to our understanding of space, time, and the fabric of the universe. He is considered one of the most creative mathematical minds of the last 100 years. And in 1989, he wrote a book called The Emperor's New Mind. In it, he made an argument that most of his colleagues thought was either brilliant or completely mad. He argued that human consciousness cannot be explained by computation. This is not an obvious thing to argue. The dominant view in neuroscience and artificial intelligence research is that the brain is, at bottom, a very complicated computer. Neurons fire, signals travel, information is processed. And out of this processing, somehow, consciousness emerges. If you built a machine that processed information in exactly the same way, it would be conscious too. Consciousness, in this view, is a software phenomenon. It runs on brains the same way a program runs on a computer, but there is nothing special about the hardware. Penrose said no. He pointed to a discovery made by the logician Kurt Gödel in 1931. Gödel's incompleteness theorem is one of the most profound results in the history of mathematics. It proved that within any sufficiently complex formal system, any system of rules and logic, there are statements that are true, but that cannot be proven within the system itself. Penrose argued that human mathematicians can sometimes see that these unprovable statements are true, through a flash of insight, through intuition, through something that feels like direct understanding rather than mechanical derivation. And if that is the case, then human minds are doing something that no formal system, no algorithm, no computer can do. Consciousness, Penrose argued, is not computational. It is something else, something rooted in the deepest laws of physics, something connected to the unresolved mysteries of quantum mechanics. But what exactly? Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, an anesthesiologist named Stuart Hameroff was staring at the inside of cells and seeing something that bothered him deeply. Hameroff had spent years studying microtubules. Microtubules are protein structures that form the internal skeleton of cells. They are part of what holds cells in shape, allows them to divide and move and organize themselves. They look, under an electron microscope, like tiny hollow tubes, and they are everywhere in neurons. What bothered Hameroff was how structured they were, how precisely organized. The protein units, called tubulin dimers, that make up microtubules are arranged in a spiral lattice with mathematical regularity. Each tubulin dimer can exist in two physical configurations. Call them the on state and the off state, or in the language Hameroff would eventually use, two states related to quantum superposition. This looked to Hameroff like it could be a computing system, not a classical computing system, not like a silicon chip, but a quantum computing system. A system capable of processing information in superposition, exploring many possible states simultaneously before collapsing to a single outcome. A quantum computer inside every neuron in your brain. Hameroff contacted Penrose. They began talking. And in 1994, they published together a theory that they called Orchestrated Objective Reduction, or Orch OR. It was the most controversial proposal in the history of consciousness science, and it is still being argued about today. The theory of orchestrated objective reduction begins with a question about quantum mechanics that Penrose had been wrestling with for years. What exactly causes the wave function to collapse? The standard interpretation, the Copenhagen interpretation attributed to Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg, says that observation collapses the wave function. But this is deeply unsatisfying, because it raises the question of what counts as an observation. Does a photon collapsing another particle count as observation? Does a measurement device? Does it require a conscious observer? The Copenhagen interpretation was always more of a recipe for making predictions than a true explanation of what is happening in reality. Penrose had a different idea. He proposed that wave function collapse is not caused by observation. It is caused by gravity. This sounds strange, but follow the logic. Quantum superpositions are states where a particle exists in two different locations or two different energy states simultaneously. But different spatial configurations of matter create different curvatures of space-time. This is Einstein's general relativity. A particle in superposition, therefore, corresponds to two simultaneous different curvatures of space-time, two versions of reality existing at the same time. Penrose argued that this situation is physically unstable. The universe cannot sustain two different geometries of space-time for long. The more masses involved, the faster this tension resolves itself. When the instability becomes critical, when the space-time geometrical difference reaches what Penrose called the Planck scale, the superposition spontaneously collapses. Not because of observation, not because of decoherence, but because of a fundamental feature of quantum gravity that we do not yet have a complete theory to describe. He called this objective reduction. The objective means it happens on its own, without any observer needed. It is woven into the fabric of space-time itself. Now enter the microtubules. Hameroff proposed that tubulin dimers in microtubules are capable of maintaining quantum superpositions. The protein structures provide enough insulation from thermal noise to allow quantum coherence, the quantum coordinated state, to last long enough to be relevant. And crucially, he proposed that this quantum coherence inside microtubules is not random. It is orchestrated, regulated, shaped, guided by the patterns of activity in the neuron, by signals coming from synapses, by the overall electrical state of the brain. When the quantum superposition in the microtubules reaches Penrose's threshold, when the mass of tubulin in superposition is sufficient to create an unstable geometry of space-time, it collapses, objectively, due to quantum gravity. And in that collapse, Hameroff and Penrose proposed, is a moment of conscious experience. Each moment of consciousness, in this theory, is a quantum event. A tiny, irreducible flash of something happening at the boundary between the quantum world and space-time geometry. Not a computation, not a cascade of neural signals, something rooted in the deepest structure of the universe. Consciousness, in Orch OR, is not something the brain produces. It is something the brain tunes into, like a radio receiving a signal that was always there. This is where most of Penrose and Hameroff's colleagues started reaching for their red pens. The objections came fast and they came hard. The warmth problem was the loudest. Quantum coherence is unimaginably fragile. In state-of-the-art quantum computers, engineers must cool their systems to temperatures a fraction of a degree above absolute zero, colder than deep space, to prevent thermal vibrations from destroying quantum states. The inside of a brain is warm, it is wet, it is alive and noisy and constantly in motion. The idea that quantum superpositions could survive in this environment long enough to do anything useful seemed to most physicists absurd. Decoherence times in warm biological systems had been calculated, and they were tiny. Femtoseconds, quadrillionths of a second. Far too short to influence the activity of neurons, which operate on the scale of milliseconds, 1,000,000 times longer. How could quantum mechanics possibly matter in the brain if the quantum states disappear 1,000,000 times faster than the brain can even respond to them? Hameroff had an answer. Several, in fact. He pointed out that biological systems have evolved over billions of years specifically to exploit the quantum world in ways that our engineering cannot yet replicate. Consider photosynthesis, the process by which plants convert sunlight into energy. For decades, scientists assumed photosynthesis was a purely classical chemical process. Then, in 2007, researchers at the University of California, Berkeley, published a paper in the journal Nature that stopped the scientific community in its tracks. The Berkeley team, led by Graham Fleming, was studying the way energy moves through photosynthetic proteins, the molecular machinery inside plant cells that captures sunlight and converts it into chemical energy. Energy must travel from the point where it is first absorbed all the way to the reaction center, where it is stored. This journey happens across a complex network of molecules, and it happens with almost perfect efficiency. Nearly 100% of the absorbed energy arrives at the reaction center. No waste, no loss. The classical explanation was that the energy takes the most efficient path. It tests one route, fails, backtracks, tries another, and eventually finds the best way. But that would waste energy. It would be slow. It could not explain the near-perfect efficiency they observed. What Fleming's team found instead was that the energy was traveling along all possible paths simultaneously. It was in quantum superposition. It was exploring every route through the molecular network at the same time, and the quantum interference between those routes was automatically, elegantly cancelling out the dead ends and reinforcing the best path. The plant was using quantum mechanics to be more efficient than any classical system could be, and it was doing this at room temperature, in a warm, wet, living cell. This discovery blew the brains are too warm for quantum effects argument wide open. If photosynthesis, one of the oldest and most fundamental biological processes on Earth, harnesses quantum coherence in warm, wet conditions, then the assumption that biology and quantum mechanics are mutually exclusive is simply wrong. In the years that followed the photosynthesis breakthrough, quantum effects were discovered in more and more biological systems. The navigation of migratory birds appears to depend on quantum entanglement in cryptochrome proteins in their eyes, essentially a quantum compass that detects the direction of the Earth's magnetic field. The sense of smell may involve quantum mechanical tunneling, where electrons pass through molecular barriers that classical physics says they should not be able to cross. Enzyme reactions across biology show evidence of quantum tunneling far beyond what classical chemistry predicts. Life, it turns out, has been using quantum mechanics since the very beginning. The question was no longer whether biology could harness quantum effects in warm conditions. It could. The question became, did the brain use quantum effects in a way that was relevant to consciousness? In 2022, a team of scientists led by Jack Tuzinski at the University of Alberta and Aristide Dogariu at the University of Central Florida published research suggesting that microtubules can sustain and transmit quantum coherent signals, specifically light-based quantum states, for biologically relevant distances. Their experiments showed that microtubules act as quantum channels, guiding photons in quantum coherent states along their length. This was not proof of Orch OR, but it was evidence that the quantum mechanical properties of microtubules were not simply irrelevant noise. Something quantum was happening inside neurons. The question of whether that something was connected to consciousness remained, and still remains, open, but the ground was shifting. And then someone asked a question that reframed everything. There is a question that quantum physicists try not to ask too loudly, because it has a way of becoming very uncomfortable very quickly. The question is this: if the act of observation collapses the wave function, if quantum states only become definite when they are measured, then what is doing the measuring? In the laboratory, we say it is a measurement device. But a measurement device is itself made of atoms, quantum atoms. So what collapses the quantum state of the measurement device? Another device? And what collapses that one? You can follow this chain backward forever. At every step, you have a quantum system measuring another quantum system, and the wave function stubbornly refuses to collapse until, at some point in the chain, something genuinely classical intervenes. Many physicists say that classicalness emerges from decoherence, from the entanglement of a quantum system with its environment, which effectively destroys the interference effects and makes the superposition behave like a classical mixture. This is the dominant view, and it works beautifully for making predictions. But it does not actually solve the measurement problem. Decoherence explains why quantum superpositions look classical from the outside. It does not explain why a single definite outcome is observed. It does not explain why, when you look at the screen in the double-slit experiment, you see the electron at one specific place, and not smeared across all the possible places the wave function allows. The collapse still happens, and something must cause it. John von Neumann, one of the greatest mathematicians of the 20th century, followed the chain of measurement all the way to its end in a 1932 book called Mathematical Foundations of Quantum Mechanics. He found, at the end of the chain, something he could not avoid naming: consciousness. Von Neumann's analysis showed, mathematically, that if you follow the process of quantum measurement through all its steps, the particle, the detector, the amplifier, the recording device, the human eye, the optic nerve, the visual cortex, the wave function does not collapse at any physical interface. It just keeps growing. The superposition keeps expanding, incorporating every system it touches all the way up until it reaches a conscious observer. And then it collapses. In von Neumann's framework, consciousness is not a byproduct of physics. Consciousness is the thing that makes physics happen. It is the thing that forces the universe to commit to a single reality out of the infinite fog of quantum possibility. Most physicists find this deeply uncomfortable. If consciousness causes wave function collapse, you immediately face a series of questions that have no obvious answers. Does animal consciousness collapse wave functions? Does insect consciousness? Does the consciousness of a bacterium? What about a sleeping person? What about an unconscious patient under anesthesia? At what level of consciousness does the universe start to become real? These questions sound philosophical. They are not. They are experimental questions. And different scientists have proposed radically different answers. The physicist Hugh Everett III proposed that wave functions never collapse at all. Every time a quantum measurement is made, the universe splits. Both outcomes happen. You, the conscious observer, end up in one branch. Another version of you ends up in the other. The universe constantly fractures into parallel versions of itself, one for every quantum event that could go either way. This is the many worlds interpretation. It elegantly dissolves the measurement problem by eliminating collapse entirely. The price you pay is accepting that there are an infinite number of parallel universes, each as real as this one, most of them inaccessible to you forever. Others proposed hidden variables. Some proposed that consciousness is an emergent property that arises from information integration. The integrated information theory of Giulio Tononi, which assigns to every system a measure called phi, representing how much information the system generates as a whole beyond the sum of its parts. High phi means high consciousness. In Tononi's framework, consciousness is not binary, not on or off, but a spectrum. And disturbingly, it is potentially everywhere. Any system that integrates information might have some degree of consciousness. The universe itself might have a phi value. Rocks might have a tiny, almost negligible amount of experience. This idea, the idea that consciousness is not something the brain creates, but something that is fundamental, something that exists everywhere in some form or another, is called panpsychism, and it is making a quiet, surprising, slightly alarming comeback in academic philosophy and theoretical physics. Panpsychism is the oldest theory of mind in human history. Ancient philosophers in Greece, India, and China all proposed in various forms that mind or experience is not something special to humans or animals, but is woven into the fabric of the world. That rocks, rivers, and stars all have some form of inner life, however dim, however alien to ours. The ancient Greek philosopher Thales believed that all things were full of gods, meaning full of the animating principle that made things real and present and alive. Plato's world soul. The Hindu concept of consciousness as the ground of all being. The Buddhist notion that awareness is the fundamental nature of mind, not an output it produces. These traditions arrived at similar places through radically different paths, and modern physics is beginning very cautiously to ask whether they were pointing at something real. For most of the 20th century, this idea was laughed out of respectable academic discourse. It seemed like superstition dressed up in philosophical language. It seemed like the kind of thing you believed before you understood chemistry. But here is the uncomfortable thing that has been driving its renaissance. The hard problem of consciousness, the question of how physical processes give rise to subjective experience, has resisted every attempt to solve it through purely materialist means. Every explanation eventually bottoms out in the same place. At some point, you have to explain how non-conscious matter gives rise to conscious experience. And no one has done it. Not once. Not even a little. Panpsychism sidesteps this problem. If consciousness is fundamental, if experience is a basic feature of the universe, the way charge or mass is a basic feature, then you never have to explain its origin. It was always there. What we need to explain is not where consciousness came from, but how simple, primitive forms of experience come together to form the complex, integrated experience of a human mind. The philosopher Philip Goff at Durham University has become one of the most articulate and rigorous defenders of panpsychism in recent years. In his 2019 book Galileo's Error, he argues that when Galileo established the foundations of modern science in the 17th century, he did so by deliberately excluding qualities, colours, tastes, sounds, feelings from the domain of physics, reducing physical reality to purely quantitative properties: position, mass, velocity. This was a deliberate methodological choice, and it was enormously productive. But it had a cost. It removed from science the very thing that, at the end of the day, we care about most: our experience. And now, 400 years later, we are paying that bill. Here is where Orch OR intersects with panpsychism in a way that is either beautiful or terrifying, depending on your disposition. Penrose's version of quantum collapse, objective reduction, is not just a trigger for consciousness. In its deeper formulation, it is a window into something much stranger. Penrose suggests that the quantum gravity process underlying collapse connects to the Planck scale, the deepest level of space-time, where space and time themselves dissolve into something granular and strange, where the distinction between matter and geometry breaks down entirely. At the Planck scale, physicists believe the fabric of reality is not smooth, but made of something like quantum foam, a seething, fluctuating structure below which we have no physics, no language, no concepts that apply. And Penrose suggests that this level of reality, the quantum geometry of space-time itself, might be the seat of proto-conscious experience. Not neurons, not biology, the fundamental structure of the universe. In this view, when your neurons fire and microtubules orchestrate quantum collapses, what is happening is not the generation of consciousness from non-conscious parts. What is happening is the amplification and organization of something that was always there, something built into the bedrock of space-time, as basic and irreducible as the speed of light. Your brain, in this picture, is not a consciousness machine. Your brain is a consciousness antenna, and the signal it is receiving has been broadcasting since the beginning of time. For years, Orch OR was a beautiful theoretical proposal with very little experimental support. Critics pointed to the decoherence problem. They pointed to the lack of direct evidence for quantum coherence in microtubules at physiological temperatures. They pointed out that there were simpler explanations for everything the theory was trying to explain, and they were not wrong to demand evidence. But the evidence has been slowly, stubbornly arriving. In 2013, researchers showed that anesthetic gases, the drugs that turn off consciousness during surgery, interfere preferentially with quantum processes in microtubules. This is deeply puzzling if microtubules are just structural elements of the cell. But it is exactly what Orch OR predicts. If consciousness depends on quantum processes in microtubules, then drugs that disrupt those quantum processes should disrupt consciousness. Anesthesiologists had known for decades that anesthetics seemed to work by some mechanism that did not fit neatly into classical biochemistry. Different anesthetic molecules are chemically very different from each other, yet they all produce the same effect: unconsciousness. What they share is a quantum mechanical property. They all bind to hydrophobic pockets in proteins in a way that is governed by quantum van der Waals forces and quantum dipole interactions. The quantum connection to anesthesia is not speculation. It is published chemistry. In 2020, a team led by physicist Greg Engel at the University of Chicago used ultra-fast spectroscopy to directly observe quantum coherence in tubulin proteins at physiological temperatures. Not for femtoseconds, for picoseconds, not long enough to run a symphony, but long enough for quantum information to travel significant distances through a microtubule lattice at biological speeds. In 2022, Penrose and Hameroff, along with collaborators in Poland and the Netherlands, announced preliminary results from experiments using quantum interference measurements in neurons. The data suggested that quantum processes in microtubules correlated with neural signaling in ways that classical models could not easily account for. None of this is conclusive. Science does not work through single experiments. It works through replication, through prediction and confirmation, through the slow grinding accumulation of evidence from multiple independent sources. Orch OR is still a hypothesis, a serious one, with serious experimental support gathering behind it, but still a hypothesis. And then there is the other flank. Tononi's integrated information theory, IIT, has been developing its own experimental program. In 2023, a landmark study, partially funded by the Templeton Foundation, brought together researchers supporting IIT and researchers supporting global workspace theory, a competing, more computational model of consciousness, and had them make specific predictions about what patterns of brain activity they expected to see in conscious and unconscious subjects. The results were published in Nature Neuroscience and immediately described as a reality check for consciousness science. Neither theory won outright. Both made predictions that were confirmed in some respects and falsified in others. But the exercise itself was extraordinary. A scientific field that had spent decades refusing to make testable predictions was suddenly doing exactly that. Consciousness science had become at last a rigorous experimental discipline, and what it was finding was deeply strange. Studies of patients under anesthesia in vegetative states and in deep dreamless sleep were revealing that consciousness does not simply turn off and on like a light switch. It has a geometry. Brain regions associated with high integrated information, hi-fi in Tononi's language, remain active even in states that appear unconscious from the outside. Some apparently comatose patients showed, under careful measurement, levels of internal brain complexity that rivaled those of fully conscious, healthy people. The border between conscious and unconscious is not where we thought it was, and it is not as sharp as we assumed. We began with a question. What are you? You are, we know this much, a collection of atoms, mostly hydrogen, some oxygen and carbon, a little nitrogen, a few grams of calcium, phosphorus, potassium, sodium. These atoms are not particularly special. The hydrogen in your body was forged in the Big Bang, 13.8 billion years ago. The carbon was cooked in the cores of stars that lived and died before the sun was born. The oxygen was breathed by dinosaurs. The iron in your blood ran in rivers across the surface of early Earth before life existed. You are the universe, rearranged. And somewhere in the rearranging, something happened that has never been fully explained. Something started to feel. Something started to hear its own heartbeat and wonder what it was. Something reached out with nerves and eyes and ears and fingertips and began to map the world that made it. And in doing so, it made the world more real. Or perhaps it simply allowed the world to notice for the first time that it had been real all along. The question science is now asking, seriously, with experiments and equations and testable predictions, is whether that feeling is a local accident of biology. Whether it emerged somehow from the specific chemistry of neurons and synapses and neurotransmitters, in a way that we just haven't fully mapped yet, or whether it is something else entirely. Whether experience, the simple raw fact of there being something it is like to be you, is not a product of the universe, but a property of it. Whether the capacity for feeling is as fundamental as mass or charge or the speed of light. Whether, in the language of Penrose and Hameroff, the geometry of space-time itself is, in some sense, alive. This is not a comfortable idea. It overturns centuries of assumptions. It challenges the story we have told ourselves about what minds are and where they come from. It suggests that the universe is not a vast cold machine populated by a few accidental islands of biological warmth and feeling. It suggests that the universe was always warm, that experience was always there, that the light of consciousness is not a rare flame flickering in the dark. It is the dark, and we are the universe discovering itself. But here is where the story gets complicated. Here is the part that Penrose and Hameroff and Tononi and the growing community of quantum consciousness researchers do not yet know. Here is the edge of the map where the words begin to run out. If consciousness is fundamental, if it is written into the quantum geometry of space-time itself, then it must have been present before brains existed, before life existed, before Earth existed. The quantum collapses that have been happening since the Big Bang, in stars, in gas clouds, in the void between galaxies, would all, in some form, involve Penrose's objective reduction? Would all, in some primitive alien way, be moments of experience? The universe would be full of consciousness, not complex consciousness, not self-aware consciousness, nothing that thinks or feels or suffers in any way that resembles our experience, but experience of some kind, some infinitely simple, infinitely alien glimmer of what it is like to exist. And if that is true, if consciousness scales with the complexity of quantum information processing, then as the universe produces more and more complex structures, it produces richer and richer experience. Life is the universe becoming more conscious of itself. Brains are the universe reaching a level of self-organization where experience becomes deep enough to reflect on its own existence. You are the universe looking at itself, and it is wondering what it is. In the summer of 2024, a research team at the Institute for Quantum Optics and Quantum Information in Vienna announced that they had successfully maintained quantum entanglement, the bizarre phenomenon where two particles share a single quantum state, regardless of the distance between them, in molecular structures at physiological temperatures for unprecedented durations. The molecules they used? Tubulin peptides, the exact building blocks of microtubules. The entanglement lasted long enough, by several orders of magnitude, for quantum information to travel the length of a neuron. Long enough to influence synaptic transmission. Long enough, in principle, to be real in the timescale of neural computation. It was not proof of Orch OR. The researchers were careful. They used the correct language. They said their results were consistent with the predictions of quantum theories of consciousness. They said further experiments were needed. They said they could not yet draw firm conclusions, but something in the data was impossible to ignore. In the weeks that followed, Hameroff posted a preprint expanding on the Vienna findings with new simulations suggesting that under conditions that closely matched living neurons, quantum coherence in microtubule networks could sustain itself long enough to generate what the paper described as macroscopic quantum entanglement across dendritic networks. Not just one neuron, not just a handful. Entire dendritic trees, the branching input structures of neurons, potentially locked into a single quantum state. A quantum unit of experience spanning thousands of connections simultaneously. This, if confirmed, would change everything. Not because it would prove that Orch OR is correct. Science is not so simple, and no single experiment could do that. But because it would mean that the brain is doing something that no classical computer can do. Something that our current models of computation cannot simulate. Something that sits at the intersection of quantum mechanics, space-time geometry, and the biology of life, right in the place where Penrose and Hameroff said consciousness lives. And then, in December 2024, something happened that the scientific community is still processing. A team of researchers studying the quantum properties of neural tissue in a post-mortem sample made an observation they cannot explain. In the hours immediately following the death of the organism, in the brief window before molecular processes fully cease, they detected coherent quantum oscillations in microtubule networks continuing independently of any external energy source. As if the quantum system was not simply processing information, but preserving it. as if the quantum state of the consciousness system was, in some sense, trying to persist beyond the death of the biological machinery that had generated it. The team published carefully. They used extremely guarded language. They stressed the preliminary nature of the findings. They invited replication and criticism. But the question they did not ask in the paper, the question that several members of the team discussed privately, carefully, in hushed tones, aware of how it would sound, was the question that has haunted philosophy and religion and every human culture since the beginning of recorded history. If consciousness is a quantum phenomenon rooted in the geometry of space-time, if it is not generated by the brain but organized by it, if the quantum information that constitutes your experience is at some level encoded not in your neurons, but in the Planck scale structure of the universe, then what happens to it when your neurons stop? What happens to the pattern? Where does the music go when the instrument breaks? We do not know. Science does not yet have the tools to answer this question. Not even close. The measurement problem in quantum mechanics remains unsolved. The connection between quantum gravity and biology remains unconfirmed. The quantum consciousness hypothesis remains exactly that, a hypothesis. Extraordinary, exciting, supported by growing evidence, taken increasingly seriously by researchers who once dismissed it entirely, but still not proven. Not yet. And that word, yet, is the most important word in science, the most dangerous, the most full of possibility. Because 20 years ago, no serious scientist believed that plants use quantum mechanics to photosynthesize. 15 years ago, no one suspected that birds navigate by quantum entanglement in their eyes. 10 years ago, maintaining quantum coherence in biological molecules at body temperature for biologically relevant durations was considered thermodynamically impossible. Every one of those certainties collapsed in the face of the evidence. Every one of those closed doors turned out to have a room behind it. The room behind this door is the biggest room in the history of science, bigger than evolution, bigger than relativity, bigger than quantum mechanics itself. Because what is behind this door is not just a fact about the universe, it is a fact about you, about what you are, about whether your experience is a temporary flicker of chemistry that will simply end, or whether it is something older, something deeper, something written into the deepest architecture of existence itself. Right now, as you watch these words form in front of you, something extraordinary is happening inside your skull, something that no scientist on Earth fully understands. But they are getting closer, and when they find the answer, it will be the last thing that ever surprises us. Or the first thing that finally, completely and forever explains everything that we are, and everything that we have always felt and known and been.